the effluent disposal from the Navarre Beach wastewater treatment plant, which was the core of that program, and we have narrowed those alternatives down to two primary ones. And so what we'd like to do this morning is to present those two to you for your input and deliberation. And with me, I forgot to introduce, my name is Joe Klaus at 25 West Cedar Street, Jacobs Engineering, and this is Daniel Broxson of the same office. This presentation will include a brief project background and the milestones achieved to date. Then Daniel will go over the conveyance and disposal alternatives. We will go through the tasks that still need to be achieved to keep the program moving forward. And then we'll open it up for any questions or comments that you may have. And feel free to stop us anywhere along the point if to clarify anything or if you have any questions.
Joe, if I can get the will of the board, I feel pretty sure we're all familiar with the background. Could we, and I hate to cut you short, but it's been a long day. Could we start with the conveyance and disposal and try to bring us to where we're at now? And if there's any members of the board that want to go over the background again,
it might be beneficial for folks that are listening in just to get it on the record.
All right. Okay.
I'll be brief. Okay, I'll be brief.
Thank you. All right.
So the primary objective is to eliminate the discharge of wastewater treatment plant effluent to environmentally sensitive areas while securing a method for the long-term disposal of effluent to sustain growth in the south end of the county. And again, the original intent was to eliminate the discharge of effluent from the Navarre Beach plant to the Santa Rosa Sound, which is designated Florida Outstanding Water. But as the program evolved, it had the flexibility to engage other utilities to help solve their effluent disposal problems as well. The main components of the project will be upgrades to the treatment plant, and the extent of those upgrades will depend on the alternative that is selected. There's a series of pipelines that will extend from the Navarre Beach plant to the point of disposal with interconnections with the participating utilities in between. And then finally, the actual disposal method. And depending on the alternative, it could be disposal to rapid rate infiltration basins on Eglin Air Force property or to the public access distribution system of Gulf Breeze. And just briefly, Jacob's scope of work is to review these alternatives. Like I mentioned, once an alternative is selected, then we will go into more detailed design on that, so it is set up and ready to go into final design or be set up for any funding that may be available.
That was one of the questions I had in reading the backup, is the addition of the Gulf Breeze alternative in the original scope of work. It might be Roger or Joe. Can you just, I thought that this scope of work came about in the last couple of years, definitely during my term, but I got this sense in reading this that this was maybe part of a scope of work that predated me. This cost analysis, if you will, the scope of work that they're doing now.
It combines the previous task orders with the subsequent task orders this board approved. Initially, they were tasked with looking at alternatives to get to the Eglin ribs as an alternative disposal for Navarre Beach effluent into the Sound. Recently, in the past, I guess, year and a half, 18 months, we looked at a South Santa Rosa utility alternative to look at providing public access reuse to connect to the South Santa Rosa Gulf Breeze reuse system. We also looked in the task order at trying to do reuse on Navarre Beach, which was presented previously earlier this year, and basically it was not economically feasible. So the work that they're doing now combines the old work that was done dating back into the early 2000s and bringing it all forward from the 2008 initial lease discussion with Eglin to the present lease
I
discussion.
thought the board had made another determination to start evaluating the costs that would be associated with actually getting the effluent out of the sound. And that's what got us started down this road, to evaluate what the different costs would be. But I guess you're telling me that that was already ongoing.
Yes, that's what initiated it,
Okay.
was
Thank you,
coming out
Mr.
of the
Chairman.
sound.
So the major milestones accomplished to date, as we did receive local approval for the Eglin lease to move forward, and the county was presented with the fair market value, which was a huge milestone in moving this program along. The county renewed the Florida Department of Environmental Protection Operations and Construction permit for the RIB site, so that is set. The county and Jacobs met several times with Holly Navarre Water System and South Santa Rosa Utilities, or Gulf Breeze, to discuss and work through the concepts of each of the alternatives. And then we have prepared, like I mentioned earlier, a detailed evaluation of those two alternatives. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Daniel to present those to you.
Okay. Can we, there we go. So first one we'll talk about is effluent disposal to the RIBs. And this is, the terms of that lease at Eglin is for about 200 acres, would be for 25 years, and the lump sum lease payment would be for $210,000. So the purpose of all our evaluations, we're going to use that 25-year term. And something we found out this morning is that at the end of that 25 years, that fair market value would be reassessed, and at that time, you'd have to assign another lease at the end of that 25 years. It's something we weren't clear on until this morning. Moving forward with the lease, Eglin has looked at the previous environmental assessment and the previous environmental baseline survey, which we were going to have to complete before executing the lease, and they've basically said it's minimal and that they're going to move that forward themselves unless they, find a ghost in a closet or something like that. But as far as they're concerned right now, it'll be pretty minimal, and they'll do that themselves. So that's very positive news. And we anticipate that lease could be signed in the first quarter of 2019. Okay, so our assumptions is that effluent would be pumped from Navarre Beach treatment plant all the way to the RIBs. There would be no intermediate site, and that we wouldn't try and interconnect and connect into Holly Navarre Water's reuse system as part of this. So it would be just disposal at the RIBs site. Because we're evaluating an alternative where to go to South Santa Rosa Utilities, in this particular iteration of this, we don't assume that South Santa Rosa Utilities would be a partner initially in the regional reuse system to be developed. And we also, based off some of our conversations with Holly Navarre, that they would be willing to share in some of the costs for capital and for maintenance. And the way we present them are the same way that they were presented in the 2008 regional reuse master plan, or I don't remember what that was called, initial study. So as you see on your screens here, we looked at multiple different ways. I think it ended up being over 20 different iterations to look at what is the most cost-effective way, whether it be to drill the sound. We looked at whether a road was densely developed or not, whether there's existing utilities, and we came down to two alternatives that could include Holly Navarre Water, and the least cost alternative would go up $399 for Navarre Beach, but the one that we show in our presentation here today, whoops, there you go, is to go closer to Holly Navarre Water. We believe that'll save them a little money, but in exchange, we also believe that they would be willing to pick up the cost difference for Navarre Beach. That's a detail that would get worked out if you move forward with this plan. Now, we would split the cost based off flow, and you can see the red portion that goes from the beach plant to Holly Navarre would be the burden of the Navarre Beach ratepayers, and then the blue portion, and including the RIBs, would be flow split, and you can see how that cost is split based off flow. The reason why they're different is the pipeline needs to be sized for the maximum volume that you're going to put through it, how fast you're going to put it through, whereas the ribs are sized by the volume. So this can change through time. And that's why the split would be a little bit different for ribs compared to the force main. And if we evaluate that alternative, I want to look at 3 main line items. The first line item is, and just to draw your attention, if you're looking at the backup documentation and not the presentation, I'm not sure what you guys can see on your screen. We did have a correction to the second line. We double counted the 736,500 for Holly Navarre water in the Navarre Beach, and that reflects throughout the presentation. We will get you that backup documentation when we're finished. But the first line item we want to look at is the $1.9 million for plant upgrades. And that is basically to build the pump station and the improvements we need to move that effluent to the ribs. The second item we look at is the total capital cost to Navarre Beach Utilities, which would be approximately $11.8 million.
Is that the 63% option or the 56% option? As far as, you know, I mean, you had 2 different breakdowns.
Yeah, so the line item force main Holly Navarre wastewater treatment plant to ribs would be broken down at the 56% for Holly Navarre and 44%. And again, this is not, nobody's agreed upon this. This is based completely on flow rates, which is similar to how you do it in a cost of service study. So we figure it's fairly fair and representative of the type of costs that may come about when you guys eventually enter into a agreement.
The numbers that you're going over are based off the 56 split, or whatever.
Right.
It's the 56-44 split, not the other one.
That is for the
Okay.
pipeline, but for the ribs, I don't know if Mark, okay, you'd be paying, it's the 37% and 63%.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the breakdown that I'm looking at for the overall 20 million. Is that based off of, you're saying it's based off of the ribs, the 63-37 example?
Commissioner,
the numbers that I'm looking at, right?
It's based on both.
It's based, yeah.
Okay.
So the ribs site would be at 63% for Holly Navarre and 37%. The pipeline itself would be at the 56 and 54.
The 12, the difference in the numbers, is that's what you were talking about? That threw me off.
And those all
Okay.
came from discussions with Holly Navarre of what their need is initially and what their need will be in the future.
Okay. So again, we'll just start over with the capital costs to Navarre Beach at approximately $11.8 million. And then if we look at how much the ribs O&M over the 25 years is only about present worth of about $725,000, going forward to reach a total net present worth for the 25 years of $12.5 million for the Eglin option. And I'll go over those items again when we go through the Gulf Breeze alternative. So the main advantages of going to the ribs is that you are creating another disposal system that's not conditional on wet weather, whereas a reuse system is conditional on wet weather, and we would either need to maintain the sound discharge or have to build additional storage. In the ribs alternative, we don't have to do that. We can just discharge to the ribs. It does provide for long-term growth, not only for Navarre Beach Utilities, but for Holly Navarre Water System. And it alleviates the future challenges for effluent disposal for Holly Navarre, and really for the southern region, because we can dispose of up to 7 million gallons per day at the ribs, which is a significant amount. The main disadvantage is that the effluent would be going to a ribs disposal as opposed to beneficial reuse in a public access setting like it would at South Santa Rosa. So the second alternative to connect to South Santa Rosa utility system, this is based off of a letter that they sent us with some agreement terms. Some of them were not specifically spelled out, but we made assumptions for those. So the first is that the maximum flow we could send to South Santa Rosa utilities would be 1.5 MGD, and you'd be capped. Anything above that, we would need to attenuate, which necessitates some infrastructure investment on the beach. The fees would be $8,333 fixed per month. That would cover up to 500,000 gallons of disposal. Anything above that would be 27 cents per 1,000 gallons.
What's the current disposal off the beach?
The current disposal costs?
Yeah, when you say 500 and some gallons, what's, not the cost, what is the current gallons coming off the beach?
About, I think it's 700,000 gallons average, Joe?
It's approximately 400,000 gallons a day over the course of a year, but in the summertime, it's up around 700,000. In the wintertime, it's down to about 100, 200,000. So it's very seasonal.
All right, and was this, did Holly, or did South Santa Rosa indicate if this would be creditable? In other words, one month we do 300,000, next month we do 600. Do we gain any kind of credit there, or is it a flat rate?
My understanding is that would be a flat rate that you would charge regardless of how much you discharge. Just like on your water bill, you pay, $15 for the first 2,000 gallons,
Okay.
whether you use them or not.
That's something we can negotiate, though. Thank you.
There would be an escalation rate applied to these fees. We just assume that it would be approximately 2%. The indication that it would be some kind of an inflation factor, which 2 to 3% would be reasonable. We would need to connect at a discharge pressure that they would dictate to us. We assume that would be 50 PSI. That should be more than enough to tie into a pressurized system. And we also would be required to provide high-level disinfection prior to disposal.
Do you know how their rates that are offered or proposed compare to other effluent disposal rates? This type of relationship exists between other utilities or municipalities?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a quick question since
Yep.
we got you paused. I know you said one issue with going this route would be based on wet weather, and if they couldn't have enough, we'd have to attenuate our wastewater somewhere. With the numbers, peak season around 750,000 gallons a day, and them saying they could take 1.5 million gallon a day, did they say, is that a guarantee that they could accept that? Or I hear those numbers and it makes me think that it wouldn't really be much of an issue.
Well, there's two things that we're missing. These are talking about average flows. So our peak flow to the Navarre Beach plant, as designed, is 2.4 MGD. So it requires you to build a basin to store the water and then pump back at that constant rate to South Santa Rosa Utilities. And then the wet weather is kind of a second conversation. The DEP, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, requires you to have either an alternate disposal method or 3 days of storage if you're going to be disposing of completely public access reuse. So in this scenario, we assume that we would just maintain the sound discharge as our alternative disposal method. You could build a 2.7 million gallon pond or basin out there, which would be, we'd probably have to purchase property to do that. So
Well, my question is would that not fall on their responsibility if we had a contract that says we could, do this much on a flow rate, and that way that could be on them to handle? Or
and Buzz, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was a second alternative that they presented to us, I think within the last week or so, maybe 2 weeks, that would allow for additional disposal capacity, and the disposal fees went up. Our estimation was at about doubled that disposal costs, and they would actually be seeking to, in that letter it said they'd seek to go to some type of an alternative disposal as well. So we'd be paying them to maintain something like a RIBS or maybe a spray field or something like that.
thanks.
So similar to the RIBS alternative, we looked at what's the most cost-effective way to get the effluent to South Santa Rosa Utilities, and it ended up being the straight shot. The savings you have by avoiding the congestion around Highway 98 isn't made up by the extra mile or so of pipe that you take to get to Leisure. And we'll just call your attention right back to those same line items. For the wastewater treatment plant upgrades, we're looking at about $3.2 million. That's to build the pump station, which is the same in both scenarios, or similar in both scenarios. You have to go to high-level disinfection, which requires us to change a couple of the processes inside of the plant. And it's also for construction of the equalization basin that we discussed so that we can send that constant flow rate back to Gulf Breeze, and a reject storage tank, which would be required by DEP rule to go to public access reuse. So that's an additional $1.3 million in infrastructure on the beach at the plant. The total capital cost would be less at only about $9.1 million, but the disposal fees compared to the O&M at the ribs is higher. So you end up making up a lot of that difference to come to a total present worth now value of $11.7 million. Well, somebody else clicking here? There you go. So the advantage is this immediately provides access, use of public access reuse water. So this is going to the highest beneficial use. It'll help supplement South Santa Rosa Utilities' reuse demands. And it's also a shorter force main than is necessary to get to the ribs alternative. The main disadvantages are the additional infrastructure that we have to build on the beach to be able to accommodate that. So it's more equipment that's at risk in the event of a natural disaster. And then also that we believe you'd have to maintain the sound discharge to be in compliance with the DEP regulations. So to just go over the comparison again, the total of alternative one present worth is $12.5 million compared to $11.7 million to go to South Santa Rosa Utilities. So there's a cost savings there. And then the qualitative impacts is the ability to eliminate the sound discharge from the DEP permit, whereas it would have to stay in the connection to South Santa Rosa. And then we would be able to provide additional effluent disposal capacity for the rest of the southern region, including Holly Navarre water. One thing that I forgot to mention in the cost analysis is when you look at either utility, Holly Navarre or Navarre Beach going alone, it's about a $3 million increase. That you see a $3 million savings when they go together and share those costs. So if either one was to go alone, their costs would increase by about $3 million.
Where are they at as far as their actual need? What is their projection at current rate without this that Holly Navarre water system could operate?
They have not shared with me any numbers about what their current projections are. Dan and myself and Joe met with Holly Navarre, and they expressed their interest in the project and expressed a need, but they did not give a definitive time.
So, the way you said it to me doesn't give me a lot of comfort, honestly, in knowing the commitment. I heard interest, but if we go this route, I guess the technical next step would be you'd have to negotiate out with them, because really this is all speculative on the cost share.
It is speculative on the cost share in some cases. This is typically how you do this in a cost of service study. If you had a regional utility that was jointly owned, this is how you would typically share those costs. They would be audited. So it's a approved method. We've discussed it with Phil and Holly Navarre, and they believe that this is a fair cost sharing for this, but there is no formal negotiation that has been entered. There's no formal agreement that's been signed.
Do you feel like financially this is something they would commit to not use the word immediately, but
I'm not
quickly
really authorized to speak on behalf of Holly Navarre Water.
And quick question, you said it'd be $3 million additional if they go it alone, or if we go it alone. Would that be to still go to Eglin?
Yes.
Saying that they may work out their own arrangement with them? Okay.
Yes. So the next steps would be to select an alternative, whether we want to dispose of the effluent at either South Santa Rosa or at the ribs. Believe it's still prudent to go ahead and secure the lease with Eglin regardless, that provides the opportunity for the need, if that's decided upon as the alternative, and finalize the conditions with the selected partner, whether it be South Santa Rosa or Holly Navarre, and then refine our design of the selected alternative. So, and then, of course, begin to look into the other items that come into a design project as easements and funding, whether we use
Thank you. So if we went the reuse route, the treatment standard for the effluent is going to be higher than if we went to the ribs.
That's correct.
Okay. So if we maintained the sound discharge, that discharge would only be utilized in the event that we were unable to pump
Yeah,
into the system for whatever reason.
if South Santa Rosa was the call up, I don't know if you remember April 2005, it basically rained every day. And if we got in a situation like that, they're going to have to call up and say, you have to go to your wet weather discharge.
Okay, and we'll let them address that as well. See, they may have a difference of opinion back there. Is there an alternative that, conceptually, I like reuse better. There's a need for it in the south end of the county. Is there a regional solution for reuse where all three utilities could be tied together, rather than this, we're going to partner with Holly Navarre Water, or we're going to partner with SSRUS? Why is there not, or is there an alternative that ties all the systems together? Because we don't need a plan for 10 years from now, but we need to plan for 30 years, 40 years from now. What's the solution in the south end of the county? And reuse is going to be a big part of that, I think.
I mean, and Joe can give a lot more history on this. This is 20 years in the making. The original South Santa Rosa regional reuse system included partnership with South Santa Rosa, Holly Navarre, and Navarre Beach Utilities. So I think that is the plan. This may be a little bit skewed in this presentation because we need to adjust some of the costs to look at just partnering with South Santa Rosa Utilities, but I believe if you did go to the RIBS facility, you still have this opportunity to interconnect and have a regional reuse system. And Joe, if you want to add anything to that?
And that's true. The original plan was to have the three participating utilities. And the benefit to South Santa Rosa Utilities was that in the summertime, they had at times exceeded, the demands exceeded the capacity to provide public access reuse. And Navarre Beach, that's when they produced the most effluent. So it was a good combination. In the wet weather periods, then that would provide an opportunity for South Santa Rosa Utilities to pump to the ribs. So that was the original concept. But that was back when Gulf Breeze was anticipating a plan at Bergman Road, which was a little more economical to connect up to that distribution system. So, but there is that opportunity. There's like you say, we need to plan for long term. This is a 25, 30, 50-year plan. And it's not inconceivable to think that Gulf Breeze, for whatever conditions dictate down the road, would want to connect up to this RIB system.
And then on a completely different note, is it feasible to convert the way we operate now to just have a pumping station on the beach and pump the raw wastewater up to interconnect with the Holly Navarre water system and have them treat it at their facility?
Yes, and I believe, and I'll defer to Roger, but I believe that has been looked at, evaluated. I think that Holly Navarre had made a request for taking the raw sewage from the plant.
Okay. Roger, do you recall that?
We had never reached that conclusion. The discussion that came was Holly Navarre looking at operating our plant on the island, with eventually the goal of taking the treatment process off the island and moving it to their inland treatment facility. So we never really got to a point to put numbers on it. But certainly the infrastructure we're talking about here today could be converted at some point in the future.
That was what I was going to ask. The main capital expenditure here is the pipe in the ground.
That's correct.
Right? Main capital expenditure is the pipe in the ground and underneath the sound. So it would be important that whatever we put in there could be utilized in the event we ultimately wanted to shut that treatment facility down, pump the raw sewage off the beach. That way we could get rid of the entire facility out on the beach other than a pumping station.
Well, can I interject something here? We're not engineers, so I got asked this question. I know I could shove certain types of fluid through certain types of line on a car, and I can't shove other fluid through that line. So I guess I'm interpreting the question is, if we install the system and later want to move raw sewage instead of treated effluent, would the lines that we're thinking about buying and putting in be able to do that? I mean, because you're dealing with you're dealing with a liquefied, treated fluid, pushing it through lines with pumps versus just crap. Period. Solids, yeah.
I believe that's possible. We just need to make sure that in the design of that system that we select a pipe material that's compatible with both. And it's much easier to go from raw treated effluent to sewage than it is to go the opposite way to convert. I don't think you'd ever be able to convert a sewage main to a effluent main or a drinking water reuse system.
And Commissioner Lynch had also said going under the sound. I thought one of the alternatives was connecting it to the bridge rather than the expense of going over the sound. So I want to make sure when we're looking at prices, we're looking at those two things. Can we do that conversion without saying, okay, guys, now we got to dig up all this pipe and put down new pipe? And two, are we going under the sound or are we going over the bridge?
And we did look at the alternatives of going over the bridge versus going underneath the sound, and the cost is actually cheaper because of the additional pipe that you'd need to run all the way east to get onto the bridge and then come back east to get to one of your points to go north. You just don't make up the
Commissioner
cost
Lynch may have
difference.
understood that, but I didn't. I thought we were going over the bridge. So, okay, thank you.
Just one other thing I wanted to add about converting later to that. You might want to consider if you're pumping raw sewage under the sound, for one, you might want to put in a parallel pipe for redundancy, because if you can't pump the raw sewage, then everything shuts down on the island. For reuse, if a pipe is defective under the sound or it leaks, well, you have an alternate discharge, the pipe going into the sound. And you need to maybe put it in some type of a tunnel or something like that. So theoretically you can, but I think you would want to install more safeguards if you went with raw sewage across the sound.
That's a good point, Joe. Yeah.
A couple additional questions. If funding for Holly Navarre water system was approved, let's say tomorrow their board decided, yes, we're going to do the $7 million in our share, do we know when we would be ready to move forward and what the funding source would be for our 13 or 12.8 million? We'd heard pot 3 thrown around, but pot 3 is not big enough for this.
No, so first of all, I'd like to start by saying pot 3 is by far the most complicated funding source, so I'm going to try and make this as straightforward as possible. Right now, there's about $5 million programmed into pot 3. Right now, that is programmed for years approximately 10 through 13 of the program. So that's approximately 10 through 13 if 2019 is year one, so about 10 years or so from now. However, having said that, there's some flexibility. The Gulf Consortium has agreed to reevaluate the funding plan every 4 years. So there'll be a new funding plan, a new mini funding plan 4 years from now. So if the board or if the county were interested in moving forward more quickly or potentially allocating more funding to this project, there should be that opportunity.
But then, just so we understand, the first project is the Soundside Drive septic to sewer conversion. That one will be largely complete, if not totally complete, in the first, before that evaluation would take place.
Yes.
So basically, we'd be deciding on if we'd want the Navarre Beach project to move ahead of the Holly by the Sea septic to sewer
Yes.
conversion project.
That's correct.
And of the 12.6, 5 million right now is currently earmarked for the Navarre Beach project.
That is correct.
Okay, but obviously, I think where that's important is Holly Navarre Water is probably operating under a timeline that is much, they're going to need to increase effluent disposal capacity faster than 10 years from now. We just recently approved that Williams Creek Greskovich expansion, and I believe that added 250 to 300,000 gallons a day. So with the growth rates that we have now, I think they have 8,500 in their system, sewer customers. They're probably going to be bumping up against their capacity again. So is there any idea or any understanding of how long they're going to have before they need to add or have additional effluent disposal capacity online?
I don't know. I don't
Okay.
know. I defer to that.
Then I'll go back to the other one. Is there a plan B for Santa Rosa County? Let's say because of the timeline, Holly Navarre Water System identifies another partner or another way to increase their effluent disposal capacity. What's the plan B for Santa Rosa County to end the practice of putting effluent in the Sound? Go it alone? That's the fallback position, is that we would spend the 23 million
If we
ourselves
don't-
and go it alone.
If we don't work out between Gulf Breeze, South Santa Rosa, and Holly Navarre Water, it would be go alone. And I think our study looked at doing that very thing, and I think the route we had chosen may have been the one that hangs it on the bridge and was the least cost. Joe, out of the 36 alternatives?
It's the route we show. It's a little deviation, but it's north of the crossing.
But basically, Santa Rosa County would be looking at around a $23 million investment to go it alone if we cannot work out a deal with Holly Navarre Water System sooner rather than later.
That's correct. I don't know if the 23 million was included the present worth, of the O&M associated with it, but.
I was just going off the
20
20 million that you had here, and you were saying that you'd have to add 3 if either one of them went alone. So then I guess it's important for the board to start considering what funding sources there would be for the portion that Santa Rosa County would be responsible for paying, because if Holly Navarre Water System is operating under one timeline where they need it in the next 36 months, then in the next 36 months, we would need to identify a funding source for how much of that 13 million that's our responsibility. All of it? Some of it? Could it be phased in? The ribs be phased in up there to where we wouldn't need, try to give an understanding of what Santa Rosa County taxpayers would need to come up with.
And that's a good point, because if it is a partnership with Holly Navarre Water System and they have funding available, if they have funding available for whatever it is that they were going to do to get capacity, then you could phase it so that they fund parts of it initially, and then the county, when funding becomes available, fund another phase of it. So that is an option.
Okay.
What are you talking about phasing now? Just the ribs area? Because once it's there, once it's on site at the ribs, it's on site.
That's correct.
Where would you
And when
get
I say
your
phasing, years, like a couple years, 2-3 years. If we needed to front load this thing because of the need of Holly Navarre Water System, and they have the funding available up front, they can fund a part of it, and then later the county can fund the segment of pipeline from the Sound to Holly Navarre.
I guess the reason it's important, Mr. Chairman, is if this board was not prepared to make the initial investment to begin our portion of effluent disposal, then they never get to partner with us. We've got the initial portion that we're going to be responsible for. That would be a significant investment, to do that first piece. And we know now that Pot 3 will not be a funding source that the county could use toward this project at a minimum in the first 4 years. So that would require identifying another funding source. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good report.
Right, we have, were you
Mr.
finished?
Chairman.
Mr. Sullivan?
I have a couple of quick questions. Looking at the summary, if we connect to SSRUS, sound discharge must be maintained. If we go with the ribs, it eliminates the sound discharge. Explain that.
Under the Florida Department of Environmental Protection rules, if you're going to a public reuse system like South Santa Rosa, you have to have an alternative disposal method in wet weather conditions, or you have to provide 3 days worth of storage. We're a little bit limited on the beach of our ability to create that approximately 3 million gallon storage pond that we would need. So we're saying you would need to maintain the sound discharge in the permit so that you could legally dispose of effluent in wet weather situations. And there's several different ways that we can do it, but I won't get into all those.
And I thought one of the goals when we first started this some years back was to eliminate the discharge in the Gulf.
That is the goal on a daily basis. When he says maintain the sound discharge, let's start describing that as an emergency discharge permit. But yes,
If we're going to the ribs, we're still going to need an emergency effluent disposal alternative, right? What's the emergency alternative for if we're going to the ribs?
It's under a wet weather scenario, you would not have to stop pumping to the ribs. You would be able to continue pumping to the ribs.
So only if there was damage to the existing pipe?
Yeah, if you had an
or
issue
something.
with the pipe, you would want to maintain the ability to control the discharge of the plant, but that would be more of like a rupture of somebody.
But there's no requirement that says, once we have the pipe into the ribs, that if we're shutting down for maintenance or damage, we don't have to have an alternate site identified.
Right, because, well, the ribs is constructed in I think in the initial phase is 10 cells. So you actually pump into one cell for a day or two, and then you pump into another cell. So you're actually rotating the water. So you have time to stop, maintain that facility. It's not like you have to take it offline. Is that?
I was speaking more of the piping from the Navarre Beach facility to get it up to the
Oh,
ribs.
okay.
If any of that piping required maintenance or if there was damage to it, what is the alternative disposal location in that scenario? I don't know if we have to identify one or not.
For your permitting, you would not have to dispose of it. There's ways you could bypass pump around it while you're doing your maintenance there. So.
All right, thank you. Give us a few minutes and we may have some questions for you. We've got the city manager from the city of Gulf Breeze here to add to our presentation.
Thank you, Commission. It's a pleasure to address you this afternoon. First, want to thank both the commissioners individually and also Administrator Schiebler for sharing with us this presentation late Friday. You see that I have with me this afternoon our 25-year City Manager Buzz Eddy and also our 30-year Public Services Director and Assistant City Manager Vernon Prather. So we're happy to answer any questions you have. I like to say that I'm kind of like that new Kenmore dishwasher that you have. So I'm the 2.0, newer, higher maintenance, a little bit more decibel level. That would be me and Buzz Eddy. But I appreciate picking up the conversation.
And you are?
And I am Samantha. I appreciate that. Samantha Abel, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. We have been talking for many months with Joe Klaus about the idea of updating, as it was presented to us, the original feasibility study for providing a means of discharging the effluent disposal off of Navarre Beach. And in looking at the presentation last Friday, we see that the scope has changed to a regional reuse system. And we're very pleased to see that. And of course, I'm very pleased to hear some of the questions asked this morning from Commissioner Lynchard, because I do think that is the threshold question when we talk about next steps. The threshold question for this commission is, do you want a regional reuse system? And we certainly know the answer to that in the south end of the county. We have residents in South Santa Rosa County who do not like the staining of their water, the sulfur smell, and they appreciate the flat $6 a month rate that you pay for reclaimed water. In the last 4 years, our reclaimed utility has grown 22%. The reason why it has not grown more than that is simply that we don't have the capacity to address the demand for reclaimed water that exists, certainly in our growing Santa Rosa County. We invested $1.2 million just last year in that utility because we know it's going to grow. We constructed an elevated storage tank. We have the capacity to accept more reclaimed water. We want to accept your effluent, and we want to turn around and be able to provide that as a valuable resource. The reason why we want to do that, of course, is because we're a peninsula. We're surrounded by salt water on 3 sides, and that is not going to change. It means we have to make sure that we are continuing to recharge the groundwater on that peninsula. It's just a simple fact that it costs more to provide water when you're on a peninsula, and so we have to make sure that we're continuing to recharge that groundwater. We understand that the conversations have changed. When this conversation started, we didn't own South Santa Rosa. We did not have a reclamation utility. But as it stands today, we do, and that's a great opportunity. As you're well aware, the City of Gulf Breeze is talking with the school board, and we hope to be able to partner with them and our council to assist with the expansion of our school system, as they are looking to purchase 45 acres of our existing ERS sites. They are also having to address recapturing that loss and effluent disposal. That means that we're talking with the school board about them hooking on their existing school sites. One of those school sites is the K through 8 school on the eastern end of our service area. That means that that transmission line will be brought closer to you. As we talk about long-range planning, we want to make sure that we are looking at the bigger picture, that we're zooming out, because we would sure hate to see Santa Rosa County bypass the connection, which is right there, in order to discharge into a rapid infiltration basin in Eglin. Understanding when I look at this, and the title is a regional reuse system, there is one alternative that provides for a regional reuse system. The other is simply to just get your discharge off of Navarre Beach. And so we just are here this morning to say that we look forward to continuing to have the conversation with you. And speaking with Joe and his team many months ago, we did follow up, with a letter, and we understand that there were assumptions made. And we do think that there is certainly room for more conversations as we go. Some of those questions you've hit on this morning when you asked, well, is it necessary through either alternative to have a wet weather permit? We would submit to you that it's best practice, certainly for that redundancy, that if you have a natural disaster or some other emergency, that you have a second option. That's just part of having a sound utility. And then also, when you're looking at the ability to serve your customers, understand that one is a restricted access, that's certainly just discharging to Eglin, and then the city's is public access, which means that if you were to be able to bring the effluent off of the Navarre Beach Island tomorrow, we're able to accept it. We're ready. Right now, we have the elevated storage tank, we have the capacity, we have the customer demand who are looking for reclaimed water for irrigation. And so in order to upgrade the Eglin proposal to have the same public access means as the city, you're looking at a $1.2 million upgrade. So just making sure that there's apples to apples, the cost of your Eglin alternative is heavy with upfront capital costs, over $3 million, whereas when you're looking at the city's cost, you're talking about the ongoing costs of just operating over time. And for some of the reasons that I've just mentioned, we think that some of those assumptions can be addressed, and we can look at driving down that number a little further. One more thing I'll add, and then I'll pause to answer any questions that you may have. But as we're talking about cost and the fact that if we could remove the effluent from Navarre Beach, South Santa Rosa Utility is able to accept and dispose of that water right now. One question that's not been asked of the city is, would we be able to partner with you to finance the cost of removing that from the beach? And we would certainly invite that question, and I would take that back to our mayor and council and say, can we just simply build that cost, that capital project, into the cost of this reclaimed utility? And I certainly think that is a question worth asking. Makes good sense to us, because in the end, the city of Gulf Breeze has this utility because you granted us this franchise. We would not be able to do this and be able to provide reclaimed water to any residents in South Santa Rosa had you not given us that ability when you granted us the franchise. And so when it comes to the two alternatives, one being to lease property from the federal government versus the other, which is to simply partner with the only government currently that provides a reclaimed utility, to me, you have that guarantee in perpetuity because it is your franchise that you granted to us, and we appreciate being able to provide that service in South Santa Rosa County. So, thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay. I thought a moment ago you said you were going to pause. I thought you were going to pause to take a breath. But, and you said also that you're 2.0, and I'm speaking for myself, I'm still rotary phone whenever you're talking about this particular item. My questions, I think I don't want to learn how to run a utility. I don't want to learn how to dispose of effluent. I want to lay out what I'd like to see as a commissioner, and then you come back to me and say, as combined, how we do this. One, how do we become regional? Two, how do we get the effluent off Navarre Beach? And then secondary, the questions you've heard, how do we get out of how does Santa Rosa County get out of the sewage business altogether and turn this over to a regional authority? And how does your plan work with Holly Navarre Water in incorporating it as a true peninsula utility altogether? And I think the final question is where would the emergency pop-off valve be? And we don't want it to continue to be in the sound.
Yes.
And, once I can get those answers, however that happens with a bottom line, that's kind of where I need to go from here. So, who else? Commissioner
Quick
Williams.
question. There's, I think Chairman Cole kind of hit on it, is that each one of the members of Fairpoint have different effluent disposal needs, or the different utilities. I guess we're not a member, but have different effluent disposal needs and priorities. So as it relates to South Santa Rosa, y'all's need is not having enough effluent during those high peak times. So I come back to the rates question. The rates that were proposed by South Santa Rosa, how do they compare in other situations that maybe you've analyzed to come up with those rates?
Well, the rates that we proposed here, again, we can, they're a continued conversation, but there's a base rate, and then there would, for under 500,000 gallons per day, and that base rate would be the $8,333. Now, that is if you provide to us the effluent that has been treated to what DEP calls the residential rate. If you wanted to simply just connect to our system and we discharge to a rapid infiltration basin, well, then that cost just about doubles to $16,333 per month. If the amount received exceeds 500,000 gallons, then there's also the cost per day, which equates by average to about $243. So,
I guess where I'm going with that, Sam, is that there's benefit to South Santa Rosa of bringing effluent, treated or otherwise, into your system, because right now you don't have enough in your system to supply the customers that you have. And I know it's not a huge revenue source for you. You're probably doing $60,000 a year in revenue, 62 and some change maybe.
That's very close. That's exactly right. Yeah.
But bottom line, I would be very interested to see if the pricing, the rates that you've suggested, are those on par, or have they been discounted because you're baking into the cake the benefit that you're going to get for the reuse? Because I don't know where else you're going to get the reuse unless it comes from Holly Navarre water system, or it comes from Santa Rosa County. So when we start looking at how we're going to negotiate the pricing, and you might be in a much better position competitively if we could negotiate a lower or see a lower price for the effluent that we could potentially bring to you, considering there's benefit to y'all. You don't have to do it, I know, but at some point you're going to run into an issue of not having enough effluent for your customers.
Yes, we did not factor in an escalation rate. I don't know what percentage that escalation rate is. I mean, obviously, when there is inflation, we look at our CPI annually with our utilities. But again, because the county is the one who granted us the franchise, that would be a conversation during our effluent disposal agreement that we would work out if there were, an annual increase for CPI. But we are very transparent in the numbers that I provided to Administrator Schiebler, brought with me, today as well, that our profit margin is very small for exactly, Commissioner Williamson, the reason that you say there's a need. There is a demand, and it benefits our utility. It does not benefit our utility for us to build an elevated storage tank that might take 20 and 30 years to see full capacity. But we made that investment of $1.2 million last year because the demand is there. There was some grant funding available as well, and that means that we have the capacity to address the problem that you've identified on the beach.
I want to say thanks for being here today and for providing the numbers. And I know that other project with Soundside Drive too, the quick way that the city responded to get the information to where we could be eligible for that, and really helps those folks out. I would just say that I would use I believe the Eglin Ribs option, and taking that effluent off of basically that reuse out of the ability to use it in a more environmentally, ecologically friendly way. As Commissioner Lyncher was asking some great questions about how could we incorporate that into more of a regional solution for the future. I would put the Eglin option as the worst option, and that now it's kind of come to the time where, with the time constraints that I would imagine Holly Navarre Water Systems operating under, now's the time to bring the folks together to the table. Let's try to find that regional solution.
And I appreciate that, and I think that's where you can help us. We actually had first provided a proposal to Holly Navarre before Joe and Roger Blaylock approached us about updating your feasibility study. And timing, is everything. So we understand that there's been some pauses in that discussion along the way. And so to the extent that you can help facilitate those conversations, we would very much invite that. Because again, it is about a regional utility and keeping a very valuable resource on the peninsula so that we can recharge the groundwater.
Sam? I was just going to echo really what Commissioner Lyncher hit on, or I'm sorry, I think you were actually the one that brought up with the sprinklers. I guess I'll speak for, I'll fall under the profession of the real estate side. I think it would be a tremendous benefit that I don't even know how you would tie a number to for the areas, especially around Gulf Breeze and, some of those in Navarre. I mean, you drive through those neighborhoods and orange fences, orange houses, orange everywhere. And the thought that, if I understand it correctly, that's from the well water. Yes. And if we could go to the reclaim, people could get that diminished. I think that may be some of that intrinsic value that we give to citizens that maybe you can't tie a number to. But we talk about quality of life a lot. And I know I wouldn't want to deal with that. And I don't think anybody up here would. Thank God I have to drink from a well water, so I feel safe with it hitting the house. But some people don't have that option. And so I like that idea. I don't know. Dan's gone. I may have to lean on Mark. I don't know what action you would need or what definitive answers. I guess just for me as a single commissioner would need to conclude to today to allow, as Samantha said, maybe us facilitate that meeting between Holly Navarre Water System, or what definitive action can we get to today to make sure that we're getting closer to getting this out of the sound?
I'd say probably just direction to engage in the conversation from this point, based on the briefing we've taken today and what we received from Ms. Abel today too. So I can speak with Dan and probably come back to you on Thursday with an answer on that.
The one thing I would ask you before Thursday, if I don't think it's even fair to ask you to come back by Thursday, but I appreciate the fact that you mentioned it. I can say it probably went through the brain, but maybe not enough to grab a hold of it, is the ability, and I appreciate Commissioner Williamson bringing up this, as sometimes we state, we overlook the obvious of funding this. Mm-hmm. And if the city of Gulf Breeze could work with us so that initial funding was absorbed, and maybe the operating maintenance cost is a little more, but now we're not having the shell shock of how do we pay for this. I think that's going to greatly help us with making that decision on what do we do, because that ultimately is going to come down to that.
We would be happy to do that, and we would do it by breakdown so that you can see that capital expense and how that's built in over time. Time might be a little bit of a challenge. Of course, I need to get that authorization from my council to bring that back to you. But unofficially, our staff can work together, and we can certainly do that very quickly.
Okay, so what is it that we'd like to see administration bring to us Thursday? Just Commissioner Williamson?
I think it's just directing staff to examine available funding alternatives now that we have the completed study, and then probably it's going to be up to our county administrator to meet with all responsible parties about what Commissioner Lunchard termed a regional solution. He brought up some good questions today about the different types of piping and redundant piping, and so there's probably going to be some follow-up. I don't know that there's an action necessarily for Thursday, other than to direct staff to take the board discussion and put it on a future meeting, what the next steps would be. Yeah, I wouldn't think that there would be action. There's a lot of stuff for staff to follow up with at this point.
Okay, so
Thank you.
noting no action for Thursday, but direction to staff to keep this in the forefront.
And Mr. Chairman, I had one other question for Joe I forgot to ask earlier, if I might. You mentioned early on that you had narrowed down the alternatives to these two alternatives. Can you maybe speak to what other alternatives you looked at once you got the effluent over to the mainland side? And then from there, what maybe are some of the other alternatives? I don't know if, Ken Walker or somebody had recommended something back in the day, or if, with all the meetings you had with Fairpoint or something you've seen, is there any other alternatives out there that we might not have thought of?
And that goes back to the late 1990s when all the technologies were reviewed, including deep well injection was one of them. Discharging all the effluent on the sound land application. Looked at putting a drainage system in areas out on that are suitable out on the island. So a whole array of technologies were reviewed, but once the Eglin property became available, that was the most cost-effective solution because it's just land application, and then the cost is in the pipes. And so once that was determined, then we just looked at the most cost-effective way of conveying it to the rivers.
I hate to bring up the word courthouse, but I just remember we thought we would have a solution there, and then at the last minute, we'd have somebody bring up alternative solutions. So I just wanted to make sure that that's not going to happen in this case, and that we know what the best solutions are. They've been identified, cost analysis, and we don't have to worry about any late game submittals.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
My thoughts
Yes,
exactly.
that is.
I'd like to see this get finished before Mr. Parker's.
So if there's anybody
Commissioner
listening out there that
Sullivan.
has any other alternative solutions, you should probably bring them forward now.
Absolutely. So, all right, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and being so patient. This has been being a long day, but that's why we get paid the big bucks.